Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 4. Well, actually, week 4 is well underway, but welcome nevertheless. In this short video, I want to talk about Neisser's 5 kinds of self-knowledge. But I want to talk about, I don't want to go through the article bit by bit because you have done that yourself or will do that yourself. But I want to look at the article from the perspective of what I have been saying since day one and what Northoff has said in his chapter on the self. So as you remember, I have been using the terms or concepts such as first-person perspective or third-person perspective on a regular basis, and by now, and so has Northoff in his chapters, and especially throughout his chapters, all of the chapters really, but especially at the beginning, and I think also in the chapter on the self. Regardless, the first person perspective, remember, refers to the subjective experience or what it is like to be a conscious subject. Now, the third person perspective refers to the scientific perspective of looking at the world objectively. And we have also seen that the discrepancy between the two establishes or describes the mind-body problem, because we can't really put them together neatly as we could put together our hands like this neatly, because we're really dealing with two different perspectives. Maybe we're dealing with just one phenomenon, and maybe it's just the brain doing all the work, and just the brain with its various neuronal mechanisms giving rise to conscious states and what we experience to be a subject within us psychologically. Or perhaps there are some other entities or properties or substances that are metaphysically different from the brain. But that may be the case, and that's basically dualism in a nutshell, substance dualism or property dualism. But from what we have been able to see, and based on neuroscientific findings and philosophical analyses, there is a pretty good argument to make for the materialistic perspective. That is, it is the brain that gives rise to consciousness, even though consciousness does not feel like a brain, right? Because from the first person perspective, you don't experience all the neural mechanisms taking place in order to produce and in order for you to enjoy conscious experiences. Okay, so here you are as a subject, and here are the third person perspective. Here's the third person perspective, the objective perspective, or the scientific perspective. Okay, so how does this relate to Neisser's article on 5 kinds of self-knowledge? So Neisser, as you remember, also says that the 5 kinds of self-knowledge are really so different and distinct, even though they work together, that they could be described as different kinds of selves. So let's just list them first. So first we have the ecological self, then we have the intersubjective self, followed by extended self, then private self, and the conceptual self. The first person perspective is what it's like to be a subject. And this perspective, you can say, runs through all the different kinds of self-knowledge. So the ecological self, what it's like to be an embodied and embedded subject in a given environment. You have all this first-person access to all the different information that goes through the different sensual modalities: vision, hearing, smelling, touching, balancing in the world. Now, this is also true for the intersubjective self. So it's true for the ecological self, and it's also true for the intersubjective self, because just like the ecological self, the intersubjective self is really rudimentary or foundational to human nature. And it kicks in day one as an infant is born, as Neisser says and shows examples. And it allows for first-person experience of intersubjective relationships. So it's a little bit, it's different in this respect from the ecological self, because the ecological self is mainly about, not only, but mainly about you or myself as an embodied agent in an environment, doing various things in an environment, or watching yourself or oneself, or experience oneself acting and engaging with a given environment. So simple examples: riding a bicycle, or maybe riding a skateboard, or driving a car. That is an act of ecological self. Now, the intersubjective self is also in a given environment, but the environment is mainly intersubjective, is vis-a-vis or in relationship to other people. And when we are in relationship, when we are in situations where we relate or have to relate to other people, we depend on feedback from them. So when we talk to other people smile, laugh, grimace, become frustrated, and speak back to us. That is basically the loop of the intersubjective relationship. And that is the basis for the intersubjective self. Because if there is no self, there is no feedback. And if there is no feedback, you or I or other people don't know what the other is feeling, what the other is about to say, what the other is sensing, what the other believes, or what the other intends to do. Okay, all of this information we get and we infer from various cues from other people: the way they behave, the way they gesture, the way they speak, what they say, and basically the body language that they use, which includes various gestures. So we don't really have to use language. This is, of course, the intersubjective self is heavily dependent on how we use language, how we communicate linguistically, that is, but it also relies heavily on body language. And you have seen this in experiments cited by Neisser in his article, but you don't need experiments to know this. You can just, there's enough information from everyday life to see that Neisser is onto something and that he's right. So, without language, we can communicate. We can do things like, or like this, or you can show the middle finger, and that has specific connotations. And if the other person, if two people are on the road driving, show each other the middle finger, they are communicating. And when two drivers are saying, apologizing to each other by raising their hands, then they're also communicating. So this communication is basically the basis of the intersubjective self. Now, this relates to Neisser's notion of the neurosocial self, because as you remember, the neurosocial self is composed of neural networks, mainly in the cortical midline structures, that give rise to the resting state, brain's resting state. Now, the social component is when the brain engages in communication with its environment, and mainly with other people. So when we engage in the intersubjective self, we take cues from the environment, from other people, what it is that we do, whether what we say is accurate or inaccurate, because we're informed by the other almost immediately. So when people say, could you explain that? I don't quite know what you mean. I don't understand that example. Could you elaborate? That is, they're asking for more information. But that is immediately a clue, or sorry, a cue and a clue also for you, whether what you're saying is accurate, whether what you're saying is logical, coherent, and clear. Because when you are not, you are very quickly reminded or asked for clarification, or reminded to be coherent or logical. So that is the social component. Now, the social cues and social information that we get from other people, we also internalize. So when, for example, you get your essays back from your professors or projects, and on your projects or essays, it says, very good job, you internalize it. That becomes part of you. You say to yourself, I did a really good job. I am very good at this. That means I'm going to be good in the future. So that information is internalized and then becomes part of who you are. And that is the social aspect. But the social aspect becomes part of the self. So the first person perspective is, in this case, or the subject, sorry, is composed of the neural workings of the brain. It is composed of the results or the effects of intersubjective communication and various theories that we use to explain the self or the subject to us, and to explain the subject to other people. And I will get to that when we talk about the conceptual self. For now, let's just stick to the intersubjective self and Northof's notion of the neurosocial self, that is. So when you get a good grade, or when you get good feedback, or when you get complimentary feedback from your parents, from your partners, from your professors or teachers, that feedback is internalized. You take it personally and it stays with you. It becomes part of you, really. So that is where the social component becomes a subjective component, or it becomes part of the self. Now, this also happens when the feedback is negative. We internalize and we think that the negative feedback is really reflective of who we are. And sometimes, to some extent, this is true, and to some extent, this is not true. So just remember that whenever you do well on an assignment, or whenever you do badly on an assignment, it doesn't necessarily speak, the feedback doesn't exhaust everything that you are. It doesn't exhaust, or doesn't describe, or doesn't define all the features of your personality and all the values that you believe in. It just means that you did either well, mediocre, you did either a good job, mediocre job, or a poor job on an assignment. Now, to some extent, this reflects partly who you are, because if you do well on assignments on a regular basis, that means you have specific qualities. You have specific qualities as a person, cognitively, and as part of your personality, to achieve such a grade. Okay, and when on a regular basis that's not the case, then you probably lack such qualities. Now, it doesn't mean that a person cannot improve. Of course they can, but when they do, they are actually changing themselves. Okay, and the contrary is also true. Okay, so again, a specific feedback from another person does not exhaust everything that you are or that you stand for, okay? But it represents something that you have done recently. And in this case, academic work, for example. But it doesn't mean that the feedback is identical everything that you represent as a subject. It refers to a few things that you do as a subject that can in the future be improved or actually pulled down or deteriorate. That is basically up to you. But you can see how deeply and how profoundly we are influenced by other people, and what we do with other people, how we interact with other people since day one when we were born, becomes part and parcel of who we are. Okay, so that is the intersubjective self. So the intersubjective self is basically built from relationships with other people and the linguistic and bodily feedback, communicative feedback that we get from other people on a regular basis. And it's the same case with the ecological self, but the ecological self, the main difference is that when the ecological self is basically the self in an environment, as it is surrounded by optic flow or optic array in a given environment. Here, the environment is the other person or another person or someone that you know very well. Okay, so that's ecological self and interpersonal self. Let's move on to the extended self. Now, before I do that, the first person perspective participates, or it's part and parcel of both types of self-knowledge, the ecological self and the intersubjective self, because in both, it feels like in both of these perspectives, you are the subject. You know what it feels like to be in a given environment. You know what it feels like to be an embodied agent, moving around, roaming around, jumping around, riding a bicycle. And you know what it's like to be in a conversation with someone, getting feedback from someone, or you know what it's like to be in a heated debate, or you know what it's like to be in a loving embrace and having nice things whispered into your ear. Okay, that is the first person perspective participates in both kinds of self-knowledge, or both types of self. Okay, so now the extended self. The extended self is based mainly on memory, and its immediate pathology is amnesia. So the memories that comprise the extended self are mostly episodes, something that you have done in the past. Let's say you reach back with your memory to your birthday, your last birthday, or last weekend, or yesterday, or even 10 minutes. So let's say you were in the kitchen and you dropped something, a plate, and it broke. Okay, that is an episode, and you can reach back with your memory and you can catalog, you can revisit your previous self in time. And when memory fails us, this is when we forget things. And when memory fails us pathologically, then that's when patients or subjects suffer from amnesia. And amnesia really obliterates or deletes the extended self or the autobiographical self. So the two terms can be used interchangeably. The extended self and the autobiographical self are mainly constructed from memories. And again, the first person perspective participates in the extended self equally as it participates in the ecological self and in the intersubjective self, because when you participate, or when you participate in the extended self, again from the first person perspective, because you're the subject, you have specific subjective experiences. Either you remember something or you don't. Either you have an emotional reaction to something that you remember or you don't. Either you smile or you grimace or you have a long face. All of these are subjective experiences. Okay, so now memory tracks the extension in past of the self that you are, based on what you have done, the experiences that you have had, or specific episodes of your life. Okay, the time, let's say, you went to Wonderland and you rode the Leviathan, for instance, right? Some people have done it more often than others. For some people, it was the first time. And for some people, it was a exhilarating, really exciting experience. And for some people, it was dreadful, okay? Really stressful and a negative experience. In any case, whether it's positive or negative, it says something about you, but it doesn't exhaust you. It doesn't exhaust the subject through and through, okay? Just because you have access to specific memories or you don't have access to specific memories, that doesn't mean you cannot, that doesn't mean the ecological self cannot be active, and it doesn't mean that the intersubjective self cannot be active. You can still engage in such selves or self-knowledge, even though you, or I mean, I don't wish it on you, of course, but even though someone suffers from amnesia, or maybe just in a trivial manner, you forget something. That does not prevent you from having conversations about other things. You don't need to necessarily draw on specific episodes or traces of memory in order to engage in the ecological self or intersubjective self. So that's important to remember. So again, the extended self tracks the self in time through specific episodes, events. And that basically, that's Locke's theory of personal identity, because your identity is tracked over time. You can reach back in your memory and refer to specific episodes in your life to identify yourself over time. But it doesn't exhaust all the other things that you can be as a subject from the first person perspective. So beyond my memories, I have access to various sensual information, cognitive information, self-reflective information, imaginative information that I can engage in readily, unless there's specific pathology that I suffer from or someone suffers from, devoid of memory. All right. So now let's move on to the private self. The private self, again, is the first person perspective, but it is also characterized by the realization that we as selves are individual beings. So my conscious experiences are not your conscious experiences, and your conscious experiences are not my conscious experiences, even though we can use the intersubjective self to communicate to each other whether our experiences were similar or different, right? We do this on a regular basis. People say, oh, I know exactly what you mean. Yes, I remember, and my experiences were very similar. Wasn't that great or wasn't that terrible? And other people confirm or negate whether that's the case. So through language, not directly, through language, we can know about each other or about the nature or character of each other, of each other's experiences. So that is an important, these two aspects are quite important. characteristics of the private self, the first person perspective, and the fact that the first person perspective really starts and ends with you, and it's not shared by other people, even though other people may go through similar experiences, similar emotional states, or similar noetic states. They can know the world in a similar, or understand the world in a similar fashion that you do. But that is not direct knowledge. That is not a knowledge that is indirect, and it's usually inferred through specific bodily reactions, gestures, behaviors, or through language. Okay, this is also the perspective where you enjoy dreams, okay, because when you are in a state of dreaming, whether mundane dreaming or quite fantastical and bizarre, colorful dreaming, it is your dream and no one else has access to your dream. You can communicate your dream if you remember it to other people. You can write it down, you can collect your dreams, but dreams are representative of your conscious states, not anyone else's. Even though there could be a common denominator among many people when it comes to specific characteristics of dream states. Okay, so again, just to rehash, ecological self, intersubjective self, extended self, the private self. So the ecological self is the main features of the ecological self are embodiment and embeddedness in a specific environment. The intersubjective self is characterized by your relationship or our relationships with other people, and then incorporating what we hear and what we see and what we understand from other people about ourselves. So the feedback that we get from other people becomes internalized in us. And this internalization is basically not strictly identical with who we are. It becomes later identical with who we are, but is related or identical with what our environment is like and what it tells us about us and how we relate to our environment, especially social environment. Okay. And after that, we have the private self. The private self is mostly akin to what philosophers call mental states or the first person perspective. So when Descartes in the 17th century advocates for his substance dualism or metaphysical dualism about human nature, as you remember, dividing human nature into two main properties, mental substance and physical substance. This is what he meant. He meant the first person perspective and what Neisser calls the private self. Okay, the fifth type of self-knowledge or type of self is conceptual self. And the conceptual self is a more mature, even though it develops from an early age. In adulthood, as with yourselves, it becomes a mature representation and an ongoing understanding of yourself as an embodied agent, as an intersubjective agent or person, as a private person, and as a person extended in space, and really encapsulates all the other selves, conceptually, that is, as an idea. Now you can, when you're 18, 19, 20 and older, you have enough experience and knowledge and intelligence to think about concepts and apply them to specific experiences, to infer information and to learn from various experiences, and to build theories. So, for example, your idea of a self is now you can say, improved or enriched by studying the self from neuroscientific and philosophical perspectives, or in this class. But it's also informed by other classes. So when you take classes in broadly in medical sciences as nursing students, you get a specific picture of what human nature is. You know that you can study human beings from a biological perspective, and you can study human beings from a chemical perspective, and you can study human beings from a kinetic perspective, and you can study human beings from a psychological perspective, and the neuroscientific perspective. So all of these perspectives are really concepts that you all have and use now and become better at using in order to understand the subject matter, understand your profession and your role in the profession. Okay? Because based on the knowledge that you have, you will have specific ideas of what human beings are, but also how to take care of human beings. So if we know that patients go through specific experiences, if we know that patients express themselves or engage with other people through intersubjectivity, then we can have, as practitioners, as future nurses or doctors, you may have, or you will have, different approach to your patients, or most likely you will have different approach to your patients, because the knowledge that you have, the concepts that you have prior shapes currently and in the future, will in the future, your relationship to other people. So the knowledge that you have is based on experiences, but it's also based on many, many concepts. And in this class, we have used many different concepts, and they mean different things. And we have used specific examples to refer to them or to underscore them, to learn them, and to accurately use them. So this is partly what Neisser means by the conceptual self. Okay. Now, the conceptual self is an idea of yourself, and the idea of yourself is really composed of many sub-ideas. So one subgroup of ideas relates to specific knowledge that you have from medical sciences, okay? And then the other subgroup of ideas will refer to, more generally, to personality, okay? Someone is an introvert, extrovert, or ambivert. Someone who maybe swings through emotional states more frequently than other people. Someone who is ethical or unethical. Someone who is diligent or not diligent. Someone who is professional or not. Okay, all of these, all of these concepts then become part and parcel of your definition, what a self is or who you are, vis-a-vis other people or in relationship to other people. So again, the concepts, the library of concepts that you have access to define your knowledge and your appreciation of yourself as a subject and other people as subjects. And the field, the professional field that you are in today as students and will be in the future. But you can see this concept, this conceptual understanding of oneself and other people starts really early, because it starts with children. Children learn pretty quickly when they develop through feedback from their parents, whether what they do is good or bad, whether what they do is right or wrong, whether a boy has been good or bad, whether a girl has been good or bad, because of the feedback that children get. And once they understand how to use concepts, they can apply them to other kids because they have been internalized. And as children grow intellectually, they start applying accurately, either accurately or at the beginning inaccurately, but very quickly, quite accurately, to specific situations. And this then brings about specific relationship that they have with other kids, and then later on as adults with other adults. So in many ways, this is the conceptual self is the most abstract self, because it's layered with all of the concepts that I have just described and that Neisser describes. And as you can see, the first person perspective becomes a common trait in all the perspectives that Neisser lists or demarcates. So I have shown how that's the case in the first four, and it's also true for the fifth one, the conceptual self, because the conceptual self, when you think about the self from a medical perspective or from a psychological perspective or from a spiritual perspective or from a typical intersubjective perspective, whatever knowledge base or concepts you rely on, you engage in the first person perspective. You are the agent who is thinking, you are the agent who is analyzing, and you are the agent who is applying either accurately or inaccurately your knowledge. So again, the first person perspective is a common feature, cuts through all the different types of self-knowledge. The third person perspective is looking at the subject matter, in this case, human psyche and human consciousness and self specifically, scientifically or objectively. But in the middle, we have the second person perspective, and the second person perspective is the intersubjective perspective, because the second person perspective is basically the perspective of taking the role of the other, learning how to infer very quickly what the other is thinking, what the other is intending, what the other is believing. And we become better and better at this as we grow older in life or more cognitively mature. But again, this starts pretty early in life with children. We learn how to do this based on body language, based on the intonation of voice, based on facial expressions, emotional expressions on faces, based on language that's used, based on many different types of information. We can infer pretty quickly and quite accurately what is happening to the other person. But this is only possible because we have had many different experiences before. And as children, we have grown in specific, we have been embedded in specific physical and interpersonal or social environments. Without interpersonal and social environments and specific physical environments, this would not be the case, because we, that is as children or other children, would be deprived of the stimulation, the constant stimulation from the environment. And when kids are stimulated by the environment, or adults, the stimuli are internalized by the subject cognitively. And some of them become part of the person, and some of them become trivial and non-important. Okay, I think that is it. I think those are the most important bits. I mean, there are other bits that are important, but I don't want to go through every experiment that Neisser lists, because they are very well explained in the article. And if there's anything that we need to additionally explain or to analyze, we can leave it to the discussion boards and office hours. So remember, office hours are from 7 to 9 on Wednesday. And I will be there every week, whether you come or not, whether one person comes, whether everyone comes. just letting you know, reminding you that office hours are on Wednesday from 7 to 9. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope this was helpful, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.